Okay, everyone, it is 4 o'clock here in the UK where I am joining from. So I'll say good afternoon from me, but I should also say good morning and good evening and even good and good afternoon to some of the other participants that we've seen already in the chat box today. So I've seen people from India, Italy, Vietnam, Myanmar, Spain, Italy, Lithuania, Taiwan, Pakistan, Oman, Argentina, and France. So a truly international group of peers joining us today for this Trinity College London Transformative Teachers webinar. Just before we get started, a tiny bit of housekeeping for those of you that are new to this, and a reminder to those that have been here many times before, and it's great to see you returning. We're going to be here today for about an hour, and everything, as you know, is already being recorded. So if you have to drop out at any moment or your internet cuts out, don't panic, it's being recorded, and you'll be able to find this on the Transformative Teachers webinar site later this month. Do play around with all the settings to make sure you've got the most comfortable speaker view and that you can see the slides nice and clearly. I know our speaker has some great slides for you today. And do keep interacting with us. As you know, we've got the chat box in front of you that you can use, but it moves quite quickly. There are lots of us here today, but please keep using it. If you have any questions that you'd like to ask us or you'd like to ask our speaker, it might be best to use the Q&A, which will be at the top or the bottom of your screen. Maybe you'll have to press the three little dots and you'll find Q&A, and those tend to stay in place. I'd like now to introduce our speaker for the day. So Chiara Bruzzano is a teacher educator, a researcher and a writer with teaching and MA TESOL supervising experience in Italy, Spain and in the UK. She's also the founder and manager of Language Ed, which is a teacher training company based in Italy, and it has a weekly newsletter which is full of tips, lesson plans, videos and much, much more, so I highly recommend that. And she's joining us here today to talk about making engaging listening activities for the language learning classroom. So I will now hand over to you. Thank you very much, Chiara.
Thank you so much, Simon, and thanks everyone for joining today. Can you hear me well?
Perfect.
Yeah, good. So I'm joining from Leeds in the UK, where it's really cold today. Can you just confirm you can see my slides? Yeah, all good. Okay, so we're here to talk about listening, and it's something that I have been studying and researching and working on for a long time. So I hope that what we discuss today proves useful to you. We're going to split the session into four main sections. The first one is about listening, how it works and why it doesn't work sometimes. Then we'll talk about teaching listening, so some approaches and some potential issues with these approaches, and I would like to know your opinions as well about this. I'll give you some do's and don'ts, some practical tips for teaching listening, and then the last section I've prepared is a demo, really, is well, a number of demos really of some free tech tools that you can find online and you can use to enhance your teaching of listening. And then, as Simon mentioned, we're going to finish with a Q&A. So we'll start with a little bit of theory, which some of you may be familiar with, but just to introduce it very quickly. How do we listen in a second language? You may already be familiar with the terms bottom-up and top-down listening. Bottom-up decoding, meaning that we build our listening starting from the smallest bit, the sound, and building up to a literal understanding of sentences, utterances, we should say. We combine that with another process, which is top-down, meaning building, in which we draw upon our knowledge of the world, of the speaker, and of what has been said to interpret that literal meaning that we got from bottom-up decoding. Now, as you can imagine, and as you know, These processes overlap, of course, but things can go wrong with both of them at any time whilst we're listening. And so what happens? What can go wrong when we listen, which is really what we're interested in because it's what happens to our students. Let's look at a couple of examples. Here are some examples of some intermediate and upper intermediate students, what they heard when listening to some audios. Look at the original version. For example, I'd like to tell you about a study that was done. What the students heard was say it with down. Or changes take place over time, so we don't always notice them. The students heard, we don't always know this sound. And then cooking over an open fire became cooking over open in fire, cooking over fire. So again, bits missed in this exercise. What do you think happened? What do you think was the cause of their problems? And can you put that in the chat for me? I'm keen to. So Lucy's saying reduction, okay, meaning. Yeah, okay, Carlos is saying confusion of similar sounds, linking, yeah, you're getting very close. Yes, this is from a study that was done a few years ago in a Canadian context, and what the researchers interpreted this is as a bottom-up issue of word segmentation, understanding where one word ends and the next one begins. And this sort of issue happens quite a lot in terms of bottom-up segmentation. Let's look at another example, though. I find this quite interesting. The original version was food is shipped in from larger distances, and the students were always asked to transcribe the last 3 or 4 words that they heard, and they got food get different relationship. Now, bearing in mind that the topic of the text was our relationship with food, and the word relationship had just occurred in the audio. What do you think could have caused this issue? Yeah, I'm just looking through your answers. Connected speech. Yeah, connected speech can definitely be a bottom-up issue, absolutely. What this kind of issue is a different problem. Lucy is saying remembering a topic and hearing it again. Okay, yeah. Yeah, definitely getting closer. Connecting to familiar words is saying, Vasavi is saying, okay. Expectations, Lana, I like that. Yeah, so this is a so-called top-down fabrication. We know what the topic is. We've just heard a word, and this is a content word. So a verb or a noun like relationship, which carries quite a bit of meaning as opposed to a grammar word. And so we've just heard a content word, which carries meaning. We know the topic of the audio, and so we expect something. And so we kind of make the audio almost fit in with our expectations. We fabricate meaning, and this is something that happens as well with students. That can happen with students, especially when they're not really hearing what's coming in, and it happens a lot in particularly in school lessons, of course, based on my conversations with teachers. So these are just some examples of the things that can go wrong when we listen. And how do we develop our listening? So there are different theories about how we develop our listening in spite of all of these issues, or perhaps thanks to all of these issues. One of the theories posits that we go from a beginner stage in which we are very dependent on sounds and words, so bottom-up listening, and that's obviously an experience that I would imagine a lot of you will have had when learning another language, right? You are trying to grasp every little bit that you can while you listen. This is, of course, very cognitively demanding. And we move towards a more proficient listener model in which processing becomes more automatic. It becomes more similar to how we listen in our first language, and so it's less cognitively demanding. So ideally, we would want to assist our learners in going from a beginner stage to a more proficient stage. But do we? And this is the big question that a lot of research has tried to answer. So how do we support our learners in going from this beginner sort of listener stage to a more advanced proficient stage? And this is where I'm going to ask you, because this is it's a question that I've discussed many times with teachers. Teaching listening is notoriously not the easiest thing. What is your main difficulty when teaching listening? Can you put that in the chat for me? Neil is asking me, is the source for this insights into student listening from post transcription? Yes, you'll find the references on my last slide, but yeah, this is the Shepherd and Butler study from 2017. Okay, students' comprehension. Okay, so one difficulty, students' comprehension and choosing or grading appropriate tasks. Okay. Finding suitable listening materials if I had a penny. Hopefully what we discussed today will help you with that a little bit. A lack of vocabulary, a few people are saying. I like that. Well, I don't like that, but I find it very insightful. Students panic and get overwhelmed. Absolutely. In fact, foreign language listening anxiety has been studied as a construct in itself. Yeah, with effects on self-efficacy, amongst other things. I love this. You're putting so many things in here. Students being unable to catch the main idea, but also sound. So I'm seeing difficulties both with bottom up and top down listening. Absolutely. Students not having enough background to comprehend the text. Very good. I can't possibly get to all of these things, but I will read them afterwards. Absolutely. So when we talk about listening, we look at course books, but not just course books. We kind of look at how things are done generally. We can look, obviously, with the caveat that teachers do things differently, but very often we get taught to do a pre-listening, a well-listening, and a post-listening stage. In the pre-listening, we'll pre-teach vocabulary, we'll set the context, we'll introduce the topic, we'll activate schemata. Then we'll have a while listening. Typically, teachers play the recording, and again, I'm generalizing, obviously, for the sake of kind of looking at how we can do things better. A first time for gist, and then a second time with for details, or perhaps with comprehension questions. Obviously, the details may change, and you'll do things slightly differently. And then a post listening, in which we'll normally check the answers to whatever task we set in the while listening. We might teach vocabulary, we might use the listening as a springboard for something else, such as speaking tasks. What is wrong with this? There's nothing inherently wrong with this, but there are some potential issues. For example, and I have observed quite a few lessons where I noticed this, the pre-teaching of vocabulary can become very long, and in fact can become distracting. Students end up focusing, particularly in school context. I've heard this from kids saying, "Oh, if she pre-taught us that, it's because it's going to go in the test." And then what they do is they listen out for those words that you pre-taught, almost as if it were some kind of priming, involuntary priming. So it can become distracting. But other potential issues, we have the while listening. Focus on testing, we're going to talk about this in a minute. Can cause anxiety, comprehension questions. They remind students of tests. There are people that have talked about this and how students can can panic and get distracted, and then they can't pick things up again because they just get lost because they're trying to answer these comprehension questions. can be hard to follow as well, and involve and also involve other skills, because you have to be able to read, the questions, you have to be able to write the answers, you have to be able to understand the vocabulary, amongst other things. Vocabulary of the questions, of course. So they can be quite cognitively demanding, as tasks, comprehension questions. The post-listening stage, we check the answers, but what often doesn't happen is we use those answers. So, okay, you got this. How did you get this? Explain to me how you got it so that I can understand if it was a guess or if you actually got it and how much you got. If you didn't get it, that's where the real interesting part is. So you didn't get it. Okay, let's work on that. We're going to do a little bit of work later in this webinar, looking at how we can make use of those wrong answers. And it doesn't really provide as much differentiation as it could. We might teach vocabulary, we might do a speaking task, which is nothing, of course, wrong in itself. But there has been a tendency to use listening for something else. So not as an end in itself, but to do it for something else, which detracts from the importance of listening, and doesn't necessarily teach learners how to listen, but rather tends to do listening, just do listening, test their comprehension, and move on to something else. So it doesn't really have a place in the classroom for its own sake, almost. But we can look at how teachers teach listening, because some research has actually looked at this. It's gone into classroom, my research, including my research, but also other people who have been looking at this for much longer than I have. I'm going to talk you through a few approaches that we have from the literature on listening pedagogy. Can you tell me in the chat as I speak if you can relate to any of these approaches, or perhaps more than one? So the first one, and you may have heard of this, is the comprehension approach. And it's something that I hinted at before. It's that pattern of listen, answer questions, check answers, move on. And the argument in the literature is very often that it focuses too much on testing. It kind of tests the students' comprehension, but it doesn't really teach them those skills, those strategies as well, but not just those strategies. It doesn't develop their bottom-up and top-down listening, amongst other things. So it doesn't develop the process of listening. Again, based on the literature, we do have other contextually appropriate approaches, and I call them contextually appropriate because I do think that we can do different things that can be appropriate for our own context. Even the comprehension approach, I think, can be used at times together with other approaches, of course, that accomplish other purposes. But I will not be here today saying to so many different people from so many different contexts, this is what is the right approach necessarily for you. So combining different things sometimes works best. For example, Graham and Santos, I apologize, found that some teachers, and they worked with teachers in schools in England and Brazil, they looked at listening as task completion. So for them, it wasn't so much the comprehension approach per se, but more listening as completing a task. This is influenced, of course, by exam requirements, which might not apply in your context. Another approach, slightly different, listening to learn English. So I hinted at this before. You do listening as a way to learn English. So as a way to develop other skills, as a way to develop systems, so vocabulary, pronunciation, grammar come to mind. Something I myself found in a piece of research that, well, my doctoral research that I did in a high school, um, is as teachers regarded listening, this was fascinating, as part of an interdisciplinary educational approach, much, much broader than just it being confined to the realm of English. So listening was simply sort of a cog in a much wider machine in which they were concerned with conveying content, developing skills like critical thinking. So again, this might apply to you or not. I invite you to reflect on this. And then we have another one, which is listening by osmosis. Some people have called it listening by osmosis. I don't know if I agree with that, but there are teachers that believe that listening will just develop with enough practice. An example of this, the perfect example of this being extensive listening, meaning listening to a lot of input outside of the classroom for the most part for pleasure. And of course, this is very useful, but it doesn't necessarily it's not necessarily sufficient, particularly when we're working with lower levels, or not just lower levels, but lower levels, kids in schools, and so on. And so these are different approaches, and I'm seeing that there's been a few responses in the chat. Comprehension at first, Mariela is saying, previously worked not only on vocab, but readings about the topic, sometimes functional language as well. Yeah. So you're kind of mixing different approaches. Okay. Now, what do teachers think about listening? Which is also one of the reasons why I'm here today, I suppose. Loads of teachers are dissatisfied with their practices, but also they say that they lack the time and expertise to find alternatives. And on the other hand, they are aware of learners' difficulties. And this is something that we have just found really in the box when I asked you, what's your main difficulty? I got like 50 responses in the space of 2 minutes because teachers tend to be aware of learners' difficulties, for example, decoding problems, but not only. But again, lack the time and lack the knowledge or sort of the expertise to innovate. But there is a sense that innovation should come. What do learners think about listening? We do have some research on that as well. I myself have done some research on this, which will interest you, particularly if you work with teenagers on the older side. Something that came out, which had come out in the work of Suzanne Graham and then other researchers before, is the theme of the unpredictability and uncontrollability of listening. Let me just give you a little quote from one of the pupils I spoke to, Enrico. This is a pseudonym, of course. I asked him about, we talked retrospectively about the lesson he had just attended. Listening was included in that lesson. And he said, for all I knew, could have been a listening on crocodiles or whatever. Now, aside from the bit on crocodiles, this is a feeling that was echoed by quite a few of his classmates, that listening is unpredictable. It's really something that they cannot control, and they felt prey to the listening, almost as if they didn't have any tools to control it. And obviously that is different from a skill like reading, where you can stop and go back and read again, for example. Listening is a lot more ephemeral. They also, interestingly, talked about the difference between real English and school English. And that was interesting to me because they characterized school English as something like not the Queen's English necessarily, but they characterize it as grammatically correct. And then when I listen to something on YouTube, I can't get a word. So they were contrasting, of course, course book English with real life English that they have a lot of access to nowadays. And that is another issue, perhaps pedagogical issue, which is kind of the gap really between what learners have this kind of polished version of English at their disposal in school or in class anyway, and then the real diversity and the intricacies of spontaneous speech whenever they step outside the classroom. Bottom line of all of this being that, in my view, teachers need tools to develop listening processes, yes, but in a way that is compatible with their contexts and their purposes for listening, because otherwise I don't feel that these innovations that we talk so much about in the literature will stick. Learners, on the other hand, need the tools to feel more in control of their listening, whatever the circumstances, so that they don't feel prey to the listening, prey to the whims of the teacher, as it's been described in interviews in my research. So, with that, part 3, do's and don'ts. These are things that I have collected over the years, based on research, based on my practice, which may or may not apply, of course, to your context, but I'd be interested to know what you think if you want to share in the chat. Starting from some do's. How can we make listening better? First of all, play the recording or video more than once if you can. Again, this may or may not apply if you're teaching an exam preparation class and you're doing IELTS. It may not apply depending on the purpose that you're playing it for. Playing it more than once allows you to stop and work on the students' difficulties. And we're going to look at a few tech tools as well to do that later. Somebody mentioned this in the chat. There's the student interests to kind of work with, allowing students to bring in their own materials, even on the spot. I know that a lot of schools, a lot of educational contexts allow students to have their iPads or their phones. And I have done this, allowing students to bring in their own materials. The good thing being, of course, that you're playing with their interest there, so you can help their motivation. Another thing, provide the students with a purpose for listening. This is another one that I have noticed when observing myself, to be honest, and teachers forgetting to provide the students with a purpose for listening. Why are we doing this? If we don't, it doesn't necessarily have to be resetting them a complex task with questions or whatever, but they have to know why we're listening. Actively develop students' bottom-up and top-down processing. I think this is a bit of a paradigm shift in some ways compared to what a lot of us, including myself, have been doing in more of a comprehension-based paradigm. What we want to do is, for example, introduce top-down knowledge activation exercises. For example, pre-listening brainstorming, but also I really like post-listening tasks. What knowledge did you need to understand that? I do this all the time. I did this recently with a video on the US elections, right? By the end, it was literally a 2-minute video, but there were so many cultural references in there that it wasn't even a case of understanding the word. It wasn't even a bottom-up issue understanding the ticket, by which we mean in a political context in America, in the US, we mean, of course, people running for president and vice president in this case. So they got the word ticket, but what does that mean in that context? So this is kind of a post-listening reflection, which you can do in your L1 as well, if that will help you, but it's so worth doing. Some of you have said in the comments in the chat, some of you have told me, yeah, they don't have enough background, and that is so true so many times. That's why you want to do some pre-listening schemata activation, but also some post-listening reflection so that they fully understand that background knowledge is a really important part of what contributes really to listening, but also so that they understand when background knowledge hindered their comprehension. You know, when I was talking about top-down fabrication, that happens too. On the other hand, we want to focus on bottom-up listening, focusing explicitly on recognizing sounds, syllables, words. One of the things I like to do, and I know that there was a talk by Sean Sweeney in this series for Trinity, which you might like to look at, is gap fills. Gap fills with weak forms. So the typical gap fill will focus on content words, your keywords, your verbs and nouns, and so on. But actually, according to some studies, what students don't get more often than the content words is the grammar words, like the prepositions and conjunctions and that stuff. And that stuff tends to get squished. So instead of being pronounced in this full form, they'll they'll be pronounced in a weak form. And Carlos is saying the schwa sound, absolutely, the schwa sound goes on to replace a lot of sounds, a lot of words, even in English. We'll look later at a tool to do this, which is called Youglish. I'll give you a demo of it. Encourage students to listen outside of the classroom, because almost any listening is better than no listening. And I would encourage you, since they already use social media, to kind of harness that. One thing I do with my students is I ask them to keep a log of the things that catch their attention on social media, mostly in the end because they don't understand them, but that is so good as well. So things that pop up and kind of scream at them. Giving students an active role as well, for example, creating a set of questions or a gap fill or responding to a dialogue personally. Another thing I like is making it a group activity or a game, particularly maybe with younger students, but there is no reason to make listening a more solitary activity than it already is by its nature. Students can benefit from sharing difficulties and helping each other make sense of a text. If you want to look up an activity to do this, which I don't have the time to go over today, unfortunately, look up the dictogloss. If somebody could put that in the chat as well. Somebody talked about listening anxiety before. Listening anxiety is an actual phenomenon. So what I would recommend is trying to tackle it with teacher modeling, of course. Something I do is share my own difficulties with listening. And I've seen teachers do this in school, actually. Okay, guys, when I listened to this the first time, I chose option A. This was during the first certificate exam preparation lesson that I saw. I chose option A, but then when we listened the second time, I noticed that they said the word green or whatever, and that gave me the context to understand that the option was actually C. This was the teacher doing this. And discussions, of course, even in the L1, because it'll make the students feel that, first of all, that they're not alone, and second of all, that there are ways of overcoming this and that the teacher knows this. If you want to use authentic materials, and somebody talked about this before, I don't know how to grade them, I don't know where to find them. Yes, one option that might work is grading the task and not the text. So the text is maybe a bit complex, yes. You might want to start with a simple task. So even just how many times you hear the word X. Using simple visual tasks. Choosing only a very small section of a video or recording and focus on that intensively. I'm talking even just a few seconds. That'll give the students a real sense of satisfaction that they managed to understand something authentic and possibly even a bit difficult. And some don'ts. So in that regard, using very long videos or recordings for an intensive listening that you play more than once and on which you do exercises can prove a little bit too cognitively demanding for students. So on average, I'd say between 2 and 4 minutes might be enough as a general guideline. I would suggest as well, take correct answers to listening tests or listening comprehension questions as sure signs of successful comprehension, because two students, and you know this, two students can get to the same answer by understanding very different portions of a text. So one thing I try to make a habit in my practice is asking why and how. Don't overstress the pre-teaching of vocabulary. We've talked about this already, because students may end up focusing on the words taught, trying to catch them in the recording, and then lose sight of general meaning or of the task that you've set them that you want them to focus on. Another common thing I used to get wrong at the beginning of my teaching: don't forget to give students enough time to familiarize themselves with the task and the speakers. Particularly if you are writing your own listening exercise, at the beginning of a listening task, there is always a period called normalization, which is when we get acquainted with the voice and the way of speaking of a speaker or more speakers. So don't put your comprehension questions right at the beginning of a text. Give them a little bit of time to familiarize themselves with it. Don't be afraid to use subtitles. I always say this because I get asked about this all the time, and I've put a reference in the reference slides for the benefits of this that I've written an article about. And don't forget to use technology wisely. And that brings me quite nicely to part 4 of this webinar. Free tech tools. We're going to start with a couple of demos of 2 tools. One is called Googlish and the other one is called Lyrics Training. But there's plenty of them. And I'm seeing Tamara. Thank you, Tamara, for this. Please put in the chat all of the other tools that you use. Tamara's mentioned Ello with some short authentic recordings. That's very nice. Let's start from Googlish. So you can use Googlish for bottom-up micro exercises. And what do I mean by that? When I said before about using the students' difficulties to your advantage, let's say that these are 2 utterances from a text. Getting and staying fit is important for everybody. It doesn't matter how old or young you are. Students don't understand, it doesn't matter. So they might answer a comprehension question. You might ask them, how did you get to that? What did you not understand? And you work out that a lot of your students didn't get the chunk. It doesn't matter. So what you do is you focus on it intensively, and not to traumatize your students, but to help them see how this chunk is pronounced. And you can do this with this tool called Googlish. That's literally a database of videos that you can search by phrase. So here I'm searching, it doesn't matter. It's brought up 21,000 videos, as you can see. And you can play different videos all containing the same phrase, because even just this little phrase can be pronounced in so many different ways. It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. It don't matter. It don't matter. It doesn't matter. Apologies for my really bad American accent. I can't do that. But there are so many features of pronunciation and connected speech potentially that can come up, even with just this little chunk, that there's so much to learn. And once the students become more aware of these chunks, these chunks, but not only of the ways that these chunks can be pronounced, the more they'll be able to adjust their expectations for when they listen. Now, another tool that I'm trying to do as quickly as possible, that I'm going to tell you about is lyrics training. And I love this. And I know that loads of teachers love this because it harnesses features such as gamification, because it's essentially a game. Students' love of music. It's hard to find students that dislike music. Personalization, and because of, see point number 2, and bottom-up listening. So what does it consist of? It's again a database of songs, and here I'm going to show you how it works. But just very quickly, Simon, can you confirm that you did not hear the audio in my previous video?
That's right. Sadly, it's not working at the
Okay,
moment.
no, that's absolutely fine. I am sorry, you're not going to get to listen to Måneskin. Being, well, Italian as I am, this is obviously what I was going to do. But lyrics training, essentially, you can search for a song or an artist, or you can search by genre as well, if that's more your thing. This is the song that I've chosen today. So let's say play now. You'll choose a level. Here I'm choosing beginner. And I can choose between write mode or choice mode, and I'll show you both. Let's start with write mode. What it does is it plays the song. You can't hear it, but but trust me, it does. It plays the song and it brings up a gap fill in the form of a game, essentially. So in this write mode, the student is asked to fill in the gap and write and type the word themselves. So here I'll type it, "You'll be the saddest part of me." Now, why is this useful? Well, obviously because it forces students in a way to focus very much on the sounds and the words that are being uttered. It focuses on obviously authentic sources, but it forces them to develop that bottom-up listening in a way that also motivates them, because music is motivational. Now, I can also use the choice mode, and in that case, the students will have options to choose from. So it's almost like a multiple choice, but they get various options and they can choose, as you can see. And the sentence is, "You'll be the saddest part of me." Now, obviously, words like "of" are sometimes pronounced in a very weak form, so it's very useful that they have to focus quite intensively on how they're pronounced. Another feature, finally, that I really like about lyrics training is this. You can make your own exercise. If you go on full lyrics, print lyrics, you can manually select the blanks that you want to focus on and literally create your own game. So then you can save it and you can kind of administer it to your students. So you can give it a title, you can set the level, and it will give you a suggestion for how many gaps to have. Now here, for example, I decided to do something that I suggested before, which is focus on grammar words like the and it and your, because of the way that they are pronounced and the way that students don't really expect them to be pronounced. And then you press and start the game, and you've got your own game with the words that you chose. Okay. It's pretty quick and quite user-friendly as well, which is another thing I like about it. Okay. Some more simple tools. We're going to start from probably the simplest of all, which is YouTube. Oh, I'm very sorry. just to finish off, simple tools from YouTube: speed, transcript, and startup. Speed. You know that you can actually change the speed of a YouTube video. And why am I saying that? I'm saying that because the next time your students come to you and they say they spoke too fast, the video was too fast, well, you can give them the option to slow it down and see what happens. The studies have conflicting findings about this, whether slowing down a video or a slower speed will actually help. It turns out some students actually don't prefer it. So that's a choice that you can give them. The transcript. So this is another sort of nice way of working with YouTube, because you've got your transcript on the side and it's interactive. So you can show it perhaps after the students have finished listening. And if they had difficulties with any of it, you can just click on the lines in the transcript and it will replay exactly that section. And you can play how it was pronounced. Also, you can have the option of starting at a certain minute and second, and whatnot, so that if you choose a video to use in class and then you want to focus intensively on a specific section of it, you can just save that URL and play it. Another one I really like is Bookmarker for YouTube. So it's literally a Google Chrome extension, which allows you guessed it, to bookmark bits of the video. And I like to use this particularly for students' difficulties. So sometimes the only task I set is listen to this once for general understanding, and then listen 2 or 3 times to spot some difficulties that you've had. So bookmark at least 2 difficulties that you've had. For example, this is intensive work on the listening and it's very personalized, and Bookmarker for YouTube helps you avoid doing it manually, really. ISL Collective is another one that allows you to put in bookmarks, but not only, actually, it allows you to put in questions at specific times in the video, as you can see, and they will come up interactively. I quite like this. You can do this with your own video, or you can use their ready-made videos. And finally, Language Reactor, which again is a Chrome extension. It works on Netflix as well, but it works on YouTube as well. And there's loads of settings in it, but what I like the most, I think, is the interactive dictionary. This is good for individual study, but not only, I think. If you're working with captions, perhaps they've listened once without captions, then you use captions, then you can simply click on a specific word and you'll get definitions, and you can even get translations. I've not activated it in this example, but you can do. So that's it. That's my references for you, just in case you were interested in following up on any of the sources I referenced. These are some articles that I'm happy to share as well. Some written by me, some written by others. And thank you so much for listening. I know I've talked a lot. I do need a drink of water. But if you do have any follow-up questions or comments or anything, I'm always happy to answer. And this is my email address.
Thank you
Thank you
very
so
much, Chiara.
much.
That's been fantastic. I mean, there's so many ideas there, and this link there, of course, solid links between what the literature and the research tells us and what we should and could be doing in our classrooms as well. So there's some really nice comments coming through, as you can see. A couple of things that stood out for me that I just wanted to round up with. I think you said it was Suzanne Graham that was talking about, teachers struggling to find time of doing the research and doing this in the classroom. But I think it's great that today we've got so many people in this webinar who've turned up, because it shows that these people really are passionate about developing, not just testing those listening skills, but really figuring out ways how we can develop, how we can personalize. And these ideas are great as well, because you've shown us things that we can do in our classrooms, but also tools that
Thank
we
you.
can then sort of teach as part of learner training, things that we can teach the
Yeah,
learners to use themselves outside, well beyond the classroom,
yeah.
not just the ubiquitous kind of, as you said, learning by osmosis. Here's a podcast, go and listen to that. But here are some tools of things you can do with that. So thank you very much for that stuff.
Thank you, Simon, and thanks everybody for the lovely comments. I should say thank you for participating and um, being so engaged in the chat. I'm very humbled trying to go through all the comments. But yeah, no, thankfully, I'm definitely, very big on learner training and kind of empowering them, because it really struck me when I actually sat down with these kids. I say kids, but they were, 15 to 17. And they were not my students, so they felt a bit freer to share with me, and it was almost like they had no power over it. And I thought, well, their teachers were excellent. That's another thing as well. I thought all of their teachers were excellent, and I thought there's a mismatch here. There's something going on, and I
Mm.
think there's a lot to be said for yeah, empowering students and giving them tools.
And this kind of links to what someone here has put in the chat box. I think it's Mohammed here who's talking. I mean, you've obviously mentioned YouTube, but you know, the age range that you've just mentioned, their teenagers especially, they might be using social media a lot. So they've got things like the Reels on Instagram or TikTok videos or things like this. So are these tools as well that you would encourage us to kind of look into and harness so that we can use those, or encourage our learners to use them as well?
That's an interesting one for a number of reasons. Yes, because they tend to be short videos. So that's good, obviously, as classroom materials. They have what I like to call non-negotiable captions. Have you noticed how a lot of content on social media has caption? You can't deactivate them. And that's an inclusive tool, of course, for many reasons. I know some teachers frown on that, but I think if that's what's happening in the lives of our kids, of our students, not just kids, but really adults as well, then why not harness that? It allows you to work with their interests and simultaneously expose them to something more complex than would be right for their level. But that is going to end up being motivational, I think, likely in most cases.
Hmm.
One caveat is that you have to monitor content very, very closely for, safeguarding and again, depending on the context that you work with. But
Hmm.
yeah, there
Hmm.
there would be a case to be made for pre-screening the content that they bring to class if we're talking teenagers, especially.
Yes, I can imagine on that, but it's nice because again, as a couple of people have written here, those all of those tools that you've shown us today, they're all free, and of course, the social media content is also free and authentic as well in lots of ways. You know, of
Mm.
course, there are scripted things on social media, but a lot of it is authentic, and it's got a huge range of world English accents there as well because everyone has access
Mm.
to it. So I guess that links into what you were saying earlier and what lots of people have been saying in the chat box about
Yeah.
course books having to stick to this traditional native speaking or native accents kind of issues.
Yeah, and I mean, I think in this there's also a case to be made, and I do this in my courses, find good role models from especially if you're working in a monolingual environment. I think finding good role models of, people that share an L1 with the kids, with the students, speaking English well. And I do this, in Italy, you'd have, of course, your Monoskin, that I've shared on lyrics training. There's all kinds of influencers. There's Berrettini, the tennis player. There's our former prime minister. There's all sorts, and social media is a good way of finding um, this sort of content. Or having kids, like Lynn is saying, students often bring in videos from TikTok and ask me to explain something they haven't understood. That's perfect. That's you don't even have to do any prep for this. Again, aside from screening potentially inappropriate content, but
Absolutely. So it's very interesting, sort of linking to the emergent needs of the emergent listening needs, we could say, of the students as they bring them to you. And it's also very student-centered, And yeah, it just seems quite engaging, I would say, with those kind of learners. Well, learners of all ages, I suppose, in that way,
Yeah,
whether they're bringing in a song or a short reel or something they haven't quite understood. I think that's
yeah.
really interesting, and it's really made me think about how to integrate the teaching of learning on teacher training courses like the Trinity Cert TESOL, so these initial ones, that we should be
Yeah,
moving away, as well as exploring the traditions of what you were pointing out before, the pre-teaching and the while listening and during.
mm,
And after, it's thinking of other ways of helping students develop and helping teachers develop their students'
yeah.
listening skills as well.
I
And there
think,
is
yeah. Sorry, go on.
which is going to say there's a fairly complicated question here. I'm going to throw this one at you right at
Mm.
the end, I think, here from Joel,
Oh
who was
God.
talking about listening in authentic situations and saying this kind of listening to authentic rather than scripted has this element of being you're eavesdropping on something, and therefore the students might have a more emotional connection to what's going on. I think that's what Joel is saying here. Or maybe even dealing with how you deal with listening in live situations, because there's more kind of skin in the game, if you like. You've got more to lose if you don't understand what's happening. Does that make sense?
Right. Yeah, yeah. So what is the question? Sorry, just make
So I
sure.
guess it's like how do we develop that skill in the
Oh,
classroom as well?
I think I'd stick to what I've said so far, but with maybe 2 points stressed a bit further. The first being talking through listening anxiety. Um, I think it would be one of my priorities because I have worked with a lot of students, particularly business English students, that did suffer from that because, like you said, it was the stakes were a lot higher than in other situations, perhaps. The second being aside from the things that we've discussed today, and I would encourage, obviously, whoever is dealing with this to identify the types of situations that the student or students would have to be dealing with so that you can work on the specifics. Working on communication strategies, because learners sometimes are weirdly unaware that they can interrupt, that they can get clarification. And it's not that they don't want to, it's just that it may be regarded as socially non-acceptable for some reason. So talking explicitly about those.
Excellent. Yeah. And I suppose that leads to kind of integrated skills of conversational skills, speaking, listening, being kind of integrated in certain
Agreed. Yeah.
situations. Yeah.
Yeah.
Excellent. Well, I think on that point there, I will once again thank you very much, Chiara, for sharing all of those ideas, and thank you to everyone who's joined us today from all over the world. Some of whom I know have sat up well beyond midnight. It must be almost 1 o'clock for some of you, according to what you wrote in the chat box
Yeah,
earlier.
I'm very grateful for that, by the way. I'm very humbled and
Very,
grateful.
very impressive,
Thank you.
very inspiring to have such
Yeah,
dedicated and enthusiastic peers around the world.
for sure.
Absolutely. So thank you very much, everyone, again, and I look forward to seeing everyone next month for the final Trinity College London Transformative Teachers webinar of 2024 next month. Thanks very much, and enjoy the rest of your days, evenings, and good night to some of you.
Yes. Thanks, everyone. Really, thank you so much.